May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Across the shattered landscapes of Belgium, Holland and Germany, Canadian soldiers stack their rifles. The Lee-Enfield No. 4, Mark I, the weapon that had been their constant companion through Juno Beach, the Scheldt and the Rhine, is finally laid to rest, hundreds of thousands of them, in armories, in captured German warehouses, in muddy fields still scarred by artillery fire. The woodstocks are scratched, the barrels worn from thousands of rounds, but they still work. They always worked. But here's what nobody talks about. These weren't just any rifles. Over 900,000 Lee-Enfields were produced in Canadian factories during the war, more rifles than Canada had soldiers to carry them. The Long Branch Arsenal near Toronto ran 3 shifts a day, every day for 5 years. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, Canada had become one of the largest small arms manufacturers in the world. And then, almost overnight, it all stopped. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to these Canadian Lee-Enfields after the guns fell silent? To understand the scale of what we're talking about, you need to picture Long Branch Arsenal at its peak. This facility, built on farmland east of Toronto, employed over 30,000 workers. By 1943, most were women. They machined receivers, fitted barrels, assembled bolt assemblies with precision that rivaled any gunmaker in the British Empire. The Canadian-made No. 4. Mark I was considered superior to British-made variants, tighter tolerances, better finish, more consistent accuracy. Between 1941 and 1945, Long Branch produced approximately 900,000 rifles. Small arms. Limited in Long Branch wasn't the only facility, but it was the giant. These rifles went everywhere the Canadian military went, and they armed British Commonwealth forces when British factories couldn't keep up with demand. When you add the earlier Canadian-produced No. 1 Mark III rifles from the First World War that were still in service, plus the Fazakerley and Maltby imports from Britain, Canadian forces had access to well over 1 million Lee-Enfields. By war's end, that's the number we're trying to track, 1 million rifles. Each one serialized, each one recorded in ledgers, each one accountable to the Canadian Department of National Defence, and then most of them vanished from public record. The immediate aftermath was chaos disguised as procedure. In May and June of 1945, as Canadian forces began demobilization in Europe, the first question was simple. What do we do with all these weapons? Imagine walking through a Canadian forward supply depot in Oldenburg, Germany, in June 1945. Rifles are stacked in pyramids 15 feet high, wrapped in oiled canvas, protected from the rain. Thousands of them in a single depot. Multiply that by dozens of depots across the British occupation zone. The logistics officers have a problem. Shipping these rifles back to Canada costs money. Storing them costs money. But destroying them? That seemed wasteful in the spring of 1945, when nobody knew if the peace would last. The first decision was to separate the rifles into categories. Category A, new or nearly new rifles, still in Cosmoline, fired fewer than 500 rounds. These would return to Canada. Category B, service-worn but functional rifles. These became the first casualties of peace. Category C, damaged, worn-out or non-repairable rifles. Immediate destruction. But those categories were fluid, interpreted differently by different commanding officers in different locations. A rifle judged worn out in one depot might be considered perfectly serviceable in another. Between June and December 1945, approximately 300,000 Canadian Lee-Enfields were destroyed in Europe. Not melted down, not carefully decommissioned. Destroyed. In this rare photograph from British archives we see the method. Rifles laid in rows in a trench, crushed by Churchill tanks driving over them repeatedly until the woodstocks shattered and the metal receivers bent beyond repair. Then the whole mass was bulldozed into pits and covered with German rubble. The British didn't want weapons floating around occupied Germany. Neither did the Canadians. The memories of 1918 were too fresh, when vast stocks of weapons had armed insurgents, revolutionaries, and criminal gangs across Europe for a decade after the armistice. But destruction in Germany was just the beginning. The rifles that came home to Canada faced a different fate. Between late 1945 and early 1947, ships arrived at Halifax carrying crates of Lee-Enfields. These were the Category A rifles, the cream of the crop. They went into storage at Canadian Forces Base Longue Pointe in Montreal, at Camp Borden in Ontario, at CFB Chilliwack in British Columbia. The plan was simple: keep them in reserve. The Canadian military would transition to newer weapons eventually, but for now, these rifles represented a strategic reserve worth millions of dollars. They were greased, wrapped, crated, and stacked in warehouses that stretched the length of football fields. What happened next is where the story fragments into a dozen different threads, each strange in its own way. The late 1940s and 1950s were the era of Cold War paranoia and colonial collapse. Nations were born, armies were raised, and everyone needed weapons. Canada had hundreds of thousands of surplus rifles, and a government eager to convert military surplus into diplomatic leverage and hard currency. The Department of National Defense, working through the Department of External Affairs, began what they called the Military Aid Program. In practice, it was arms dealing with a diplomatic veneer. The first major shipment went to the Netherlands in 1947. The Dutch were rebuilding their military and fighting a colonial war in Indonesia. They needed rifles immediately. Canada sold them 75,000 Lee-Enfields at bargain prices, roughly $12 per rifle, a fraction of the manufacturing cost. These Canadian rifles, marked with the distinctive C broad arrow and long branch manufacture stamps, ended up in the jungles of Java and Sumatra, carried by Dutch colonial troops fighting Indonesian independence fighters. Some of those rifles were captured by Indonesian forces and used against their former owners. By the 1960s, you could find Canadian Lee-Enfields in the hands of Indonesian village militias, half a world away from the factories that made them. The second wave went to Pakistan and India in 1947 and 1948, immediately after partition. Both nations were arming rapidly, both expected war with each other, and both needed rifles. Canada, maintaining studied neutrality, sold Lee-Enfields to both sides. Approximately 100,000 rifles went to Pakistan, another 50,000 to India. When the First Kashmir War erupted in 1947, Canadian-made rifles were fired by both armies, often at each other across the same valley. You can still find these rifles today in the markets of Peshawar and Dara Adam Khel, their stocks replaced with local walnut, their sights adjusted for local conditions, still functional 75 years later. But not all the rifles left Canada through official channels. In 1950, the Canadian government made a decision that would shape the civilian firearms market for decades. They would sell surplus Lee-Enfields to Canadian citizens. The program was administered through the Director of Arsenals, and the price was astonishing. $15 per rifle shipped directly to your door if you had a letter of good character from your local police chief. No license required, no registration. This was 1950s Canada, when rural farmers needed rifles for pest control and hunting, and the government saw surplus disposal as both practical and patriotic. Imagine opening a crate in your farmhouse in Saskatchewan in 1951 and finding a Lee-Enfield still packed in Cosmoline, unfired since it left the factory in 1944. That was the reality for thousands of Canadians. Between 1950 and 1960, an estimated 200,000 Canadian Lee-Enfields were sold domestically through this program. They became truck guns, hunting rifles, farm guns. The long barrels were cut down, the military stocks were replaced with sporterized wood, the sights were modified. Most lost any collector value, but they gained something else, a second life as working tools in the Canadian wilderness. Some of these domestically sold rifles have remarkable stories. In 1987, a rifle was recovered from a trapline cabin in northern Manitoba that had been abandoned in the 1960s. The Lee-Enfield was still hanging on the wall, loaded, covered in dust, but completely functional. When collectors traced the serial number, they discovered it had been manufactured in December 1943, shipped to the Italian front in early 1944, saw action at the Gothic Line, returned to Canada in 1946, sold to a farmer in 1952, and used to shoot wolves threatening livestock until the cabin was abandoned. One rifle, 4 decades. 3 continents. But the strangest destinations were yet to come. In 1954, the Canadian government received a request from the newly formed State of Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces were standardizing their armament, and they needed rifles urgently. The problem was political. Canada had maintained diplomatic relations with Arab states and couldn't be seen openly arming Israel. The solution was a third party. Canada sold 50,000 Lee-Enfields to a Belgian arms dealer named Joseph van den Bempt, who immediately resold them to Israel through a cutout company in Panama. The rifles were shipped to Haifa in crates marked agricultural machinery. By 1956, during the Suez Crisis, Canadian Lee-Enfields were in the hands of Israeli paratroopers dropping into the Sinai. Those same rifles, or rifles from the same shipment, were captured by Egyptian forces and ended up arming Palestinian Fedayeen in the 1960s. A Canadian rifle, built to fight Germans, ended up in the deserts of the Middle East, passed between enemies who didn't know its origin. The 1960s brought another wave of dispersal. As African colonies gained independence, new nations needed to arm new national armies quickly and cheaply. Canadian Lee-Enfields went to Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Ghana. They were sold through British intermediaries, usually for less than $10 per rifle, often in batches of 10,000 or more. In Kenya, they armed the King's African Rifles during the transition to independence, then became the weapon of the new Kenya Army. During the Shifta War in the 1960s, when Somali separatists fought the Kenyan government in the Northern Frontier District, both sides used Lee-Enfields. Canadian-made rifles fired across the same thorn scrub in heat that would have been unimaginable to the women who assembled them in Toronto winters 20 years earlier. By 1970, the Canadian military had completely phased out the Lee-Enfield in frontline service, replacing it with the FNAFAL. But reserves and training units still had tens of thousands of them. The government faced the same question again. What to do with surplus? The answer this time was different. The Canadian Rangers, the military's Arctic surveillance force composed primarily of indigenous peoples in remote northern communities, specifically requested to keep their Lee-Enfields. The Rangers argued that the rifle was reliable in extreme cold, easy to maintain with minimal tools, and chambered in .303 British, a round still commonly available for hunting. The Department of National Defence agreed. While the regular forces moved to modern semi-automatic rifles, the Rangers kept their Lee-Enfields until 2015. Let that sink in. Canadian Rangers were issued Lee-Enfields, a rifle designed before the First World War, until 2015. 70 years after World War II ended, Canadian soldiers in the Arctic were still carrying the same rifles their grandfathers had carried in Europe. Some of the most haunting discoveries came much later, in places nobody expected. In 1978, a Canadian diver exploring a World War II shipwreck off the coast of Newfoundland discovered crates of Lee-Enfields in the hold. The ship had been a coastal freighter sunk by a German U-boat in 1942 while carrying supplies to Goose Bay. The rifles had been underwater for 36 years. When brought to surface and carefully cleaned, several were still functional. The Cosmoline had protected them even in salt water. They were turned over to Parks Canada and eventually ended up in the Canadian War Museum. In 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Western researchers gained access to East German military archives. In a warehouse outside Dresden, they found 15,000 Canadian Lee-Enfields, still in their original 1945 packing, covered in decades of dust. The rifles had been captured by Soviet forces at the end of the war, shipped east, catalogued and forgotten. The East German government had stored them as a strategic reserve that was never needed. When German reunification came, these rifles were destroyed, but not before collectors documented them. Nearly pristine examples of Canadian wartime production, preserved by accident behind the Iron Curtain for 44 years. The paper trail gets murky when you try to account for every rifle. The Canadian government's own records are incomplete. A 1995 audit by the Department of National Defence attempted to reconcile wartime production numbers with disposal records. They concluded that approximately 200,000 to 250,000 Canadian Lee-Enfields were unaccounted for in official records. Not lost, unaccounted for. The difference is important. These rifles weren't stolen. They were likely destroyed, sold, or transferred through channels that didn't require detailed documentation by the standards of the 1940s and 1950s. Record keeping wasn't what it is now. A quartermaster in 1947 signing off on 10,000 rifles for disposal might have meant destruction, sale, or transfer to another Commonwealth nation. The paperwork often didn't specify. Some turned up in unexpected conflicts. During the Troubles in Northern Ireland, from the late 1960s through the 1990s, both British security forces and Irish Republican paramilitaries used Lee-Enfields. Many were stolen from British Territorial Army armories, but forensic analysis of rifles captured from the IRA showed that some were Canadian-made, likely acquired through American gun shows in the 1960s and smuggled across the Atlantic. A rifle built in Toronto to defend democracy ended up in the hands of insurgents fighting British rule. History has a bitter sense of irony. The collector market exploded in the 1980s and 1990s. Canadian Lee-Enfields, especially those with clear long branch markings and documented wartime service, became highly sought after. A rifle that sold for $15 in 1950 might fetch $1,500 by 2000 if it was in original condition with matching numbers. But original condition was rare. Most had been sporterized, modified, or worn out through decades of hard use. Collectors began scouring estate sales, farm auctions, and gun shows across Canada and the United States. Every once in a while, someone would find a rifle still in its original military configuration, wrapped in an attic or forgotten in a barn, and the firearms community would buzz with excitement. In 2003, a remarkable cache was discovered in Afghanistan. Canadian forces deployed to Kandahar province as part of Operation Enduring Freedom began reporting that local militia fighters and Taliban insurgents occasionally carried Lee-Enfields. Ballistic analysis confirmed that some were Canadian-made. The most likely explanation is that these rifles had been part of British military aid to the Afghan government in the 1960s, possibly mixed with Australian and Indian rifles, during the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s. A rifle manufactured in Ontario in 1943 to fight the Axis powers ended up in the Hindu Kush 60 years later, carried by forces fighting a completely different war for completely different reasons. The weapon outlived the ideology that created it. Today, if you want to find a Canadian Lee-Enfield, you have several options. The Canadian War Museum in Ottawa has one of the finest collections, with examples from every year of production, including rare prototypes and experimental variants. The Long Branch Arsenal itself is gone, demolished in the 1980s to make way for waterfront development, but a small monument marks the location. Private collections across Canada hold thousands of examples, many still functional, some restored to museum quality. Gun shows in Canada and the United States regularly feature Canadian Lee-Enfields, though prices have climbed steadily. A rifle in excellent original condition with documented service history can sell for $2,000 to $3,000. Cut-down sporterized versions might go for $300, but the most poignant survivors are still in service. When the Canadian Rangers finally retired their Lee-Enfields in 2015, after 70 years, some of those rifles were offered to the Rangers who had carried them. Many accepted. These rifles now hang in homes across Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, and Yukon, not as museum pieces, but as family heirlooms. They represented a connection between Indigenous communities and the Canadian military that was unique, complicated, and deeply personal. A ranger might have carried the same rifle his father carried, maintaining a tradition across generations. When they were finally retired, it marked the end of an era that stretched back to before many of these communities had regular contact with the outside world. Perhaps the strangest modern discovery came in 2017, when a construction crew in London, England, unearthed a sealed room beneath a demolished building that had once been a Commonwealth military depot. Inside were 847 Lee-Enfields, Canadian and British production mixed together, stacked against the walls. They had been bricked up in 1946 and forgotten. The building above had changed hands multiple times, been renovated, repurposed, sold, and finally demolished, and nobody knew the rifles were there. When the room was opened, the rifles were heavily corroded but still identifiable. Serial number traces revealed that 203 were Canadian Long Branch production. They were handed over to the Imperial War Museum and the Canadian government. Some were conserved for display, the rest were destroyed according to British law. But for 71 years, they had waited in darkness beneath the streets of London, a time capsule of 1946, sealed by accident or by a bureaucrat's decision to forget rather than deal with surplus. The environmental impact of all this disposal is rarely discussed but worth considering. When 300,000 rifles were crushed and buried in Germany in 1945 and 1946, they weren't biodegradable. Those burial sites, scattered across what became West Germany, East Germany, and eventually unified Germany, contained tons of steel, brass, and wood slowly corroding into the soil. Some sites have been identified and excavated by archaeologists studying the immediate post-war period. Others remain unmarked, their locations lost when the officers who ordered the burials died, or when records were destroyed. There are forests in northern Germany where metal detectors still pick up massive anomalies, likely burial pits from the disposal operations of 1945. They're unmarked, undocumented, and largely forgotten, but they're there. Physical evidence of a logistical problem solved by brute force. The rifles that went to developing nations often had the longest operational lives, in some cases absurdly long. A 2019 report from the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs documented small arms recovered from conflict zones in Central Africa. Among the AK-47s and G3 rifles, investigators found 3 Canadian Lee-Enfields, still functional, still being used by village defence forces in the Central African Republic. Serial number traces suggested they had originally been shipped to Kenya in 1963, then moved through several hands, possibly sold when Kenya upgraded its military, purchased by arms dealers, smuggled across borders, traded for other weapons, and eventually ending up in the hands of fighters who had no idea they were carrying a rifle older than their country. These rifles had been in continuous service, in someone's hands, for over 70 years. That's not obsolescence. That's immortality through simplicity. The technological story is worth examining too. Why did these rifles last so long? The Lee-Enfield design dated to 1895, with the number 4 variant introduced in 1941 representing refinements rather than fundamental changes. By World War II standards, it was already outdated, bolt action in an era moving towards semi-automatics. But it had advantages that transcended technological advancement. It was reliable. The action was smooth, fast, and tolerant of dirt, sand, and mud. The 10-round magazine gave it double the capacity of most contemporary bolt-action rifles. It was accurate enough for combat purposes, and crucially, it was easy to maintain and repair with basic tools. A village blacksmith in Pakistan or Kenya could fix a Lee-Enfield. You can't say that about an M16 or an AK-47. That simplicity meant the rifle could outlive its supply chain, outlive its manufacturer, outlive the empire that designed it. There's a philosophical weight to these objects that goes beyond military history or collector interest. Each rifle represented approximately 80 hours of human labor to manufacture. Multiply that by 900,000 rifles, and you're looking at 72 million hours of work, mostly by women, mostly in Canada, mostly during the crisis years of 1941 to 1945. Those hours were poured into an object designed for a single purpose, to kill efficiently at range. And then the purpose evaporated on May 8th, 1945, and August 15th, 1945, when the wars ended. The rifles didn't evaporate. They persisted. They found new purposes, new hands, new conflicts. They became symbols of whatever cause held them: liberation, oppression, independence, occupation. The same rifle, depending on who carried it and when, could represent entirely opposite ideals. The human stories embedded in these objects are fragmentary, but powerful. We know that some of the women who built Lee-Enfields at Long Branch worked there for the entire war. They would have assembled hundreds, perhaps thousands of rifles each. If you could bring one of those women forward to 2019 and show her a Lee-Enfield still in use in the Central African Republic, still functional, still doing the job she built it to do 75 years earlier, what would she think? Pride, horror, amazement. The rifle had outlived her youth, outlived the war, outlived the country it was built to defend in its original form. It had become something else entirely, a tool divorced from its original context, serving purposes nobody in 1943 Toronto could have imagined. The final accounting is impossible. Of roughly 900,000 Canadian Lee-Enfields produced during World War II, we can account for perhaps 400,000 with reasonable certainty. Destroyed in Europe, 300,000. Sold domestically, 200,000. Exported through official channels, 250,000. Rangers and Canadian military retention, 50,000. That's already 800,000, and the numbers overlap and conflict depending on which records you trust. The remaining 100,000 to 500,000 rifles, depending on production estimates, exist in a documentary void. Some were certainly destroyed in ways that weren't recorded. Some were sold or transferred through channels that didn't keep detailed records. Some are still out there, in attics and basements and gun safes, unrecognized by their owners as pieces of Canadian history. Some are in war zones we haven't documented yet. Some are underwater in shipwrecks we haven't found. Some have been destroyed and recycled, their metal now part of cars or buildings or bridges, atoms dispersed and repurposed. What remains is a scattered diaspora of objects, each one a thread connecting 1943 Toronto to dozens of other times and places. A Lee-Enfield in a museum case in Ottawa, another in a gun safe in Montana, another rusting in an Afghan cave, another hanging on a wall in Iqaluit, another at the bottom of the Atlantic. They're fragments of a moment when Canada's industrial capacity was bent entirely toward war production, when women worked night shifts building weapons, when the world was on fire and everyone was needed. The rifles themselves are silent on what they've witnessed. They bear proof marks, serial numbers, inspection stamps, the bureaucratic language of military production. But they don't carry the memories of the hands that held them or the places they've been. That history has to be reconstructed from fragments, documents, and the occasional dramatic discovery. In the end, the Canadian Lee-Enfield represents something universal about military surplus. Nations pour resources into weapons during war, then face a crisis of disposal during peace. The weapons persist long after the crisis that created them. They become tools, symbols, relics, and sometimes weapons again in conflicts their makers never imagined. The rifle outlived the Third Reich it was built to fight. It outlived the British Empire whose design it carried. It outlived the factories that made it. It even outlived, in some cases, the nation of Canada as it existed in 1943. The same laws, same borders, same self-conception. What hasn't changed is the rifle itself. Mechanically, functionally, a Canadian Lee-Enfield from 1943 is the same object today as it was 80 years ago. History flows around it, the rifle endures.